When a high school teacher's prejudice pushes a determined student to her limits, an unexpected twist at the Teacher of the Year ceremony leaves everyone speechless. Discover how resilience and kindness can break down even the toughest barriers in this heartwarming tale of redemption and courage. The classroom was unusually quiet that day. The students were all seated, heads bowed, working on an assignment. I was observing the scene from the back, noting how some kids were diligently scribbling in their notebooks, while others occasionally glanced up at the clock, hoping for the bell to ring. At the front of the class stood Mrs. Anderson, the teacher. She was known for her sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude, but there were murmurs among the students that she didn't treat everyone the same. Over time, I'd started to notice it too. Today, it became painfully clear. Maria, a shy but bright student, sat near the window. She was the type who rarely spoke up, but when she did, her thoughts carried weight. Maria's parents were immigrants, and though she worked hard to fit in, she often became the target of subtle snide remarks, especially from Mrs. Anderson. "Maria," Mrs. Anderson called out, her tone laced with impatience. "Do you even understand the question? Or is this too difficult for you?" The class fell silent. Maria looked up, startled. I think I understand," she replied softly. Mrs. Anderson rolled her eyes. "You think you understand? That's not good enough. Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time learning proper English, you'd actually contribute something useful in class." A few students exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others stared at their desks, unwilling to make eye contact. I saw Maria's face flush red. She opened her mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she looked down at her notebook, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her pencil. I could feel the tension in the room. Mrs. Anderson didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. She turned back to the board and continued teaching as though nothing had happened. But for Maria, the damage was done. I watched as she sat there, silent but visibly hurt, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself invisible. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. Students quickly gathered their things, eager to leave the tense atmosphere behind. Maria, however, stayed in her seat, slowly packing her books into her worn backpack. Her face was blank, but her eyes betrayed her pain. As the classroom emptied, I noticed a couple of students whispering and glancing in Maria's direction. One of them, Emma, walked over. She wasn't particularly close to Maria, but even she seemed uncomfortable with what had just happened. "Hey," Emma said hesitantly, sitting on the edge of Maria's desk. "That wasn't cool, what Mrs. Anderson said. Are you okay?" Maria forced a small smile and nodded. "I'm fine," she said quietly, though her voice wavered. Emma frowned, but didn't push further. After a moment, she gave Maria's shoulder a gentle squeeze and left. Maria sat there for a while, staring out the window. I could see the wheels turning in her head. It wasn't just the humiliation. There was something deeper, something that had been building for a long time. Later that day, I found her in the library. She was sitting at a corner table, surrounded by books, notebooks, pens, and flashcards were spread out in front of her. It was clear she was working on something big, something that demanded her full focus. I approached her cautiously. "Maria," I said softly, "are you sure you're okay? You don't have to act like it didn't bother you. It's okay to feel upset." She looked up at me, her eyes tired but determined. "It's not the first time," she admitted. "Mrs. Anderson has always looked down on me, on people like me." Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. "I can't change how she sees me, but I can prove her wrong." I nodded, impressed by her resolve. Maria wasn't just hurt, she was motivated. And in that moment, I realized she was stronger than most of us had ever given her credit for. What I didn't know was just how far she would go to prove her worth. The days turned into weeks, and Maria kept her head down, working harder than ever. She stayed late after school, poring over books in the library. She asked questions during class, even though Mrs. Anderson often responded with condescending remarks. She joined the debate club, even though public speaking terrified her. I could see the transformation happening before my eyes. Maria was no longer just trying to survive. She was thriving, despite the odds stacked against her. Her classmates began to notice too. Emma started sitting with Maria during lunch, and soon others joined. They saw her dedication, her quiet confidence, and they respected her for it. Slowly but surely, Maria's circle grew, and her voice started to carry weight in ways it never had before. Still, Mrs. Anderson remained cold. Every achievement Maria shared, whether it was a perfect test score or a glowing recommendation from another teacher, was met with dismissive comments. "I suppose even a broken clock is right twice a day," Mrs. Anderson quipped once when Maria aced an exam. Maria didn't react outwardly, but I knew those words stung. She carried them silently, using them as fuel to keep going. One day, a flyer appeared on the school bulletin board. Nominations for the annual Teacher of the Year award were open. Students were encouraged to nominate an educator who had made a lasting impact on their lives. As I read the flyer, a thought struck me. What if someone like Maria, who had endured so much, could be the one to bring about change? What I didn't realize then was that Maria already had a plan that would turn the school on its head. It was a regular Friday morning when Maria walked into the principal's office. She had a small folder tucked under her arm, her posture straight but her hands slightly trembling. I later learned she had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but it didn't make it any less nerve-wracking. Inside the folder was a heartfelt essay she had written, nominating Mrs. Anderson for the Teacher of the Year award. "Yes, Mrs. Anderson." The principal, Mr. Hayes, was surprised to say the least. "Are you sure about this, Maria?" he asked, adjusting his glasses as he read through the essay. Maria nodded firmly. "I am. She has impacted my life more than she knows." What Maria didn't say, but what I knew, was that her nomination wasn't about praise. It was about highlighting how Mrs. Anderson's actions had shaped her resilience, her determination, and her desire to succeed against all odds. Word about the nomination spread quickly. Some students were confused, others outright shocked. "Why would you nominate her?" Emma asked Maria one afternoon. "She's been awful to you." Maria's response was simple but profound. "Sometimes people teach you lessons in unexpected ways. I don't want to dwell on the pain. I want to grow from it. And maybe, just maybe, this will make her reflect too." The essay Maria submitted wasn't just about Mrs. Anderson's shortcomings, it was about her journey. She wrote about how those moments of humiliation had driven her to push past her limits, to rise above the negativity, and to find her own strength. When the day of the award ceremony arrived, none of us were prepared for what would happen. The school auditorium was packed, buzzing with excitement and anticipation. Teachers, students, and parents filled the rows, all waiting to see who would be crowned Teacher of the Year. Maria sat quietly near the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple dress, but there was a quiet elegance about her, a confidence that hadn't been there before. She watched as names were called for various awards, but her gaze remained fixed on the stage. Mrs. Anderson was seated closer to the front, her usual stern demeanor intact. She looked composed, but every so often her eyes darted toward the stage with an air of expectation. When the principal finally took the podium to announce the Teacher of the Year, the room hushed. "This year's award goes to someone who has, perhaps unknowingly, left a profound impact on one of our most dedicated students," Mr. Hayes began. "The nomination we received was heartfelt and eye-opening, a testament to the resilience and strength of our student body." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Teacher of the Year award goes to Mrs. Anderson." The room erupted into applause, though some claps were slower and more hesitant than others. Mrs. Anderson rose from her seat, a surprised but pleased look on her face. She made her way to the stage, her heels clicking against the polished floor. As she accepted the award, Mr. Hayes added, "And now, we'd like to invite the student who nominated her to say a few words." The room fell silent. A ripple of murmurs spread as Maria stood up and made her way to the stage. Mrs. Anderson's smile faltered as she watched Maria climb the steps. The tension in the room was palpable as Maria reached the microphone, holding a piece of paper in her hands. Maria took a deep breath as she stood at the microphone, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. She looked out at the crowd, at her peers, the teachers, and most importantly, at Mrs. Anderson. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I know many of you might be surprised to see me here, especially because of who I'm about to speak about. But tonight isn't just about an award, it's about the lessons we learn, sometimes in ways we don't expect." She glanced down at her paper before looking directly at Mrs. Anderson. Mrs. Anderson, you've taught me so much this year. Not just about academics, but about resilience, strength, and the importance of staying true to myself. You pushed me, sometimes in ways that hurt, but it made me stronger. It made me want to prove to you, and to myself, that I am more than the labels people assign to me. The room was silent, every word sinking in. There were moments when your words stung, when I felt small and out of place, Maria continued, her voice breaking slightly. But those moments forced me to grow. They made me work harder, believe in myself more, and realize that my worth isn't defined by anyone else's opinion. Mrs. Anderson's face was unreadable, but her grip on the award tightened. I nominated you because, whether you meant to or not, you changed my life, Maria said, her gaze unwavering. You taught me the most important lesson of all, that I am capable, that I belong, and that no one can take that away from me. The crowd erupted into applause. Some people wiped tears from their eyes, moved by Maria's courage and grace. Maria turned to Mrs. Anderson and smiled faintly. Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. I hope that, just as you've left an impact on me, this moment leaves one on you too. Mrs. Anderson looked at Maria, her face a mix of emotions, shock, guilt, and perhaps a glimmer of admiration. She opened her mouth to say something, but couldn't find the words. Maria stepped down from the stage, her head held high, while the applause continued. In that moment, she wasn't just a student anymore. She was an inspiration, a symbol of strength and resilience. The days following the ceremony were different. Maria walked through the school hallways with a newfound confidence. People who had once overlooked her now smiled, nodded, and even stopped to talk. Her classmates, teachers, and even the principal began to see her not just as another student, but as someone remarkable, a person who had faced adversity with grace and courage. As for Mrs. Anderson, something shifted in her too. She was quieter in class, less sharp with her words. She no longer looked at Maria with disdain. In fact, on more than one occasion, I noticed her pausing mid-sentence, as if catching herself before saying something unkind. One day, Mrs. Anderson called Maria to her desk after class. Her usual stern expression was softer, almost hesitant. "Maria," she said, her voice low, I want to apologize for the way I treated you. I didn't realize how much my words were hurting you." Maria stood still for a moment, processing the unexpected apology. Then she smiled, that kind and forgiving smile that had come to define her. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. That means a lot." From then on, their relationship was cordial, even amicable. Mrs. Anderson still had her moments, but she was trying. And that was enough for Maria. Maria's story didn't just inspire her classmates, it rippled through the entire school. Her speech became a reminder of the power of resilience and the importance of kindness. Teachers started reflecting on their own behaviors, and students felt more empowered to stand up for themselves and others. Years later, Maria graduated at the top of her class, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university. She went on to achieve incredible things, but she never forgot the lessons she learned in Mrs. Anderson's classroom. And Mrs. Anderson, she changed too. She became more compassionate, more understanding. She never spoke about that night at the ceremony, but everyone could see its impact on her. Maria didn't just prove her worth, she changed hearts. And in the process, she reminded all of us that even in the face of prejudice and cruelty, strength and grace can shine brighter than anything else. Thank you for taking the time to read this powerful story. If it inspired you or made you reflect, please don't forget to hit the like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. If you want to see more heartwarming stories like this, make sure to subscribe and share with your friends so they can join in the journey too. Your support means the world to us. Stay tuned for more inspiring content.